Jesus is with the disciples in Caesarea Philippi, which is at the southern part of Mount Hebron's mountain range, and just north of the Sea of Galilee. And for the Greeks and the Romans, they looked at this landscape that had a lot of caves and rivers that flowed out of these caves. And they imagined that it was waters that were flowing from the river Styx, which in Greek mythology is the river that takes the souls of the dead down into Hades, the underworld. So that very theatrical and ominous setting is where Jesus turns to the disciples and asks them, "Who do other people say the Son of Man is?" Which is just sort of a lengthy way in this passage of Jesus referring to himself. And the people that are mentioned are all prophets who are dead. You have Elijah and Jeremiah, Old Testament prophets, who would come out of the woods and correct the king and the people whenever they were not living according to God's laws. And you've got John the Baptist, who is found in the Gospels, and who is the last of these sort of Old Testament strain of prophets, all of whom have died. The people that are reminded of that, the ones that other people think of when they think of Jesus, are these prophets who have come before him. So Jesus then turns and says, "But who do you say that I am?" And Peter professes, "You are the Son of God." That's not unique to him, because all the disciples profess that. You'll remember a few weeks ago when we read about Jesus walking on the water and then calming the storm. But he also adds to that, "You are the Messiah," meaning the anointed one, the one whom God would appoint and anoint through the prophets to be a leader of the people. But a leader like the people had never seen before, because Jesus is the Son of God. And what follows after that is something that is unique to Matthew and that the other Gospels don't address. And that has caused quite a stir and a lot of conversation in theological circles, particularly 500 years ago. Jesus looks at him and calls him by his nickname, which was Rock. I asked the children this morning in confirmation, what do you suppose that tells us about the kind of person that he was? Was he solid and unfailable, or was he thick-headed and a bit stubborn? Or maybe a combination of the two. But Jesus turns this and says, "And on this rock I will build my church." 500 years ago, that was a matter of big debate because the Protestant Reformation was emerging. And Luther and other revolutionary thinkers believed that all of us should have the opportunity to read Scripture in our own language and interpret it for ourselves. And that pushed against the more orthodox teaching that only those who are part of the official church should have the authority to do that and then to teach the people. And for the Roman Catholic Church at that time, they looked at this passage as a way of saying that Peter was the first pope, and everyone who had been ahead of what they believed was the one true church followed in line with Peter. The actual particularities of the debate are not that important to us, but we, along with all Christians, believe in what's known as the apostolic procession. And that is that the church that you and I inhabit is a church that has been handed down to us from Jesus Christ. A church that we see coming into its being in this encounter between these two figures in the gospel. Jesus proclaiming to Peter, "You are a rock, and on you I will build my church." And then he gives him some awesome responsibilities. When they are there in front of the gates of the underworld of the dead, Jesus says to him, "And death and the forces of darkness will have no victory over you." Jesus doesn't promise him or the other disciples that we will never face darkness or death, but only that ultimately it will not overcome us. And whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven. It's Jesus' way of saying to Peter that the work that he has begun will continue in him. This week, the nominations committee met, and we'll meet again next week as we prepare for Charge Conference. And in the United Methodist Church, lay people are chairs of all the administrative committees that oversee the work in a local parish. But the pastor is always the chair of the nominations committee, the committee that appoints people to serve on all the others. This reflects our value and our sense of church leadership, that church leadership is a shared venture between clergy and laity. It's meant to encourage us to work together and to listen to one another and to encourage one another. Our Book of Discipline recognizes that clergy and laity each come with specific skills and specific responsibilities, but we are all responsible for leadership within the church. That's true on the local church level, and that's true on the annual conference level. Every year when Methodists gather in Virginia for annual conference, clergy are there because they are members of the conference. But each church has a lay representative as well, so the representation is 50-50. If this church were large enough to have multiple pastors, like my home church that had a senior and 2 full-time associates, they had 3 low delegates in order to keep it even. That's our system of government. And as the chair of the nominations committee, if I was appointing someone to a very important position, the way Peter is described in Matthew wouldn't want to make me put him in charge of anything more important than maybe sharpening pencils. Peter is the one who speaks before he thinks. He is the one who, as you remember a couple of weeks ago, got out of the boat before realizing he did not have adequate faith to overcome the laws of gravity. He is the one that, according to Matthew, denies Jesus 3 times on the night that Jesus is betrayed. But yet, this is the guy that Peter is the one that Jesus looks at and says to him, "When I ascend, you're in charge." What on earth was Jesus thinking about when he did this? It reminds me of a story from humorist Garrison Keillor called "A Trip to Grand Rapids." It's about a small farmer who is frustrated because it's the spring and the spring rains have come early that year. And all of this rain has caused mud out in the fields, and he can't be out breaking up the ground and planting the way he normally is that time of year. Well, his wife is tired of seeing him sit around the house and mow. So she suggests to him, every year at this time, your brother invites you to go to Grand Rapids and to join him on that fishing tournament that he participates in. You can't be working now. Why don't you go and do that? And he says, "Well, I don't know. I'm not sure it would be responsible for me to take off now." And she says, "Well, even if it stopped raining now, you still wouldn't be able to get out in the field. What do you have to lose? Let's at least go and get a change of scenery." And then, very enthusiastically, their teenage daughter said, "Yes, Mom and Dad, you should go. You should go off this weekend to that. I think it would be good for you." And so he decides they will, and they pack their bags, and with equal enthusiasm, the teenage daughters carry the bags out and put them in the trunk of the car. It's later in the day when they're leaving, and as they drive off, they suddenly notice there's an unusually large amount of traffic that's going in the opposite direction back towards their home. And he decides he's going to take a different route, and he stops on the far end of the field. And they can look and see their house. And they can see that it's lit up like a cruise ship out on the ocean. And they can hear the faint sound of the bass that's coming away. And he said, I'm not sure I like what's going on there. I want to go and see what's happening. And his wife protested and said, well, you know, we left them in charge of the house. And when you do that and you hold them responsible for that, you've got a certain amount of accountability that you're giving over to them. And he says, well, if you don't think we should go. And his wife said, of course we should. You lead the way. And so in the dark, they head off through this muddy field. And as they get closer to the house, they realize that not only do they hear the music, but they can feel it pulsate. Once they get to the outskirts of the yard, they pass the dog that's asleep in the yard next to his water dish. And on the other side of the water dish is an empty bottle of beer. And he thought to himself, they gave beer to the dog? And they walk up and they can look in the window and they can see what's going on. And he sees his youngest daughter get a cigarette and put it to her lips while some young boy that he didn't recognize lit it. And he didn't even know that his daughter smoked. There's another couple of young people who are there, and they've got some kind of hand-rolled cigarette that they're passing around. And he thinks to himself, well, that's generous. At least they're sharing. Aware of what's going on. Well, guilt takes him over, and he decides he doesn't want to confront them. So he turns to leave, but just as he does, he's met by this growling dog. His family dog, who does not recognize him, and begins to bark. And with that, the youth begin to pour out of the house, and his daughter looks very wide-eyed at him. And realizing there's nothing she can do to cover this up, she just says, we decided to have a party. And they both talk to their daughters and say, we love you and we've left you here in charge. And they decide they're going to go back. But then he realizes that somewhere along that muddy field in the dark, he dropped his wallet. So he turns and he mentions something to his youngest daughter, who turns and yells to her friends, hey, my dad needs money. And so they pass the hat and they collect money so that he can have gas money for the trip to Grand Rapids. They go all the way back, and by the time they make it to his brother's house, it's very late, and they've just left out a key for him. And a note saying, I'll be here to pick you up at a certain time, and we can go to the trip, which is just a few hours from there. He's talking about this with his wife, and his wife says to him, you know what it reminds me of? It reminds me of when we used to go to the gravel pit when we were young. That's how you and I first met. And there were cups there, and people were drinking whatever. And I remember I had spilled some beer on my leg. And you got out your handkerchief, and you wiped off my leg. And I thought, what a nice young man that he's helping me. And how you wiped and wiped my leg. And as he went to bed, he was thinking about his daughters and what he left behind. And he realized, I'm getting old. Those two are going to care for me in my old age, and they will be my replacements. And then his memory went back to the gravel pit and meeting his wife, and he fell asleep. When we think about what Jesus was thinking when he left Peter in charge, when he gave him this awesome responsibility to say that you, Peter, will have authority over the power of death, and whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven. It sounds crazy to think that Peter would be the one. It's like adults going away and leaving their teenage children in charge of the household. But Jesus had two particular things that he was thinking about at the time. One is, he says to Peter, when Peter professes him as Messiah and Son of God, I know that you did not think of this on your own. And in the back of his mind, I wonder if Jesus is saying, because I know you're not that smart. But he says to Peter, I know you could only say this if God in heaven gave this to you. He knows that Peter, for all of his impetuousness and all of his many flaws, he is a man of faith. He's a man who listens for God and acts based on what God is directing him to do. And it also gives us a touch into how Christ relates to us. You and I can be very quick to give up on other people. And we can certainly doubt ourselves at times. But the fact that Jesus makes this pronouncement to Peter says something about the faith, not just that we have in God, but the faith that God has in us. All of those wondrously flawed and sinful men and women that we read about in the Bible. And God does all of these miraculous things in their lives and through them. And you and I are the inheritors of this, with all of our doubt, with all of our flaws, with all of our judgmentalism. You and I are the inheritors of Peter's proclamation. You and I are the ones who profess Jesus as the Christ and the Son of God. And Christ has given us authority over the power of death and the power of darkness. You and I carry on the work that Christ began, because that is what it means to be the church. You and I are teenagers, and our Heavenly Parent has left us in charge of God's house.